Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome, everyone, to this Featured Voices podcast brought to you by peakprosperity.com. It's August 20th, 2019. I am your host, Dr. Chris Martenson. You know what I value most here at the tender age of 56? Having how I think altered. Now, that could mean I learned something new entirely, or it could mean seeing things in a whole new way after someone has taken the time to craft a new framing, a new way of connecting the dots. I know immediately when this happens. I get a prickling sensation down the back of my neck, time kind of dilates and slows down a bit, and I get tunnel vision as I bore into the words. Now, perhaps it's always been true that after a certain age, humans begin a quest for inner growth, wisdom, maturity. We seek these things. But it's also true that we live at the most momentous of times. Perhaps, as some think, we're perched right on the edge of a new age of humanity that sees us conquer and settle nearby planets. But it seems at least equally possible that due to various limitations of the way we process and form narratives, we humans might also be right on the verge of a very long and punishing dark age. As you may know, my work involves trying to break down the most obviously silly of narratives, one that is easily revealed as fraudulent with just a minimum of inquiry, which is the dependence of our economic and financial systems upon something called exponential growth. Now, why is that silly? Because we live on a finite planet. Economics is a subset of the natural world, not the other way around, and it's impossible to sustain exponential growth within a finite volume. Well, last I checked, the Earth is a sphere. Those have surface areas, which means there's a discrete and finite amount of land, sea, minerals, water, soil, all that stuff. Now, what stands between such a simple yet powerful observation and collective human action? Sadly, it's not data. We all know that already. And it's not logic or reason. Rather, it's rooted in our ability, or inability as the case may be, to consciously modify our stories, shift our cultural narratives to align our inner selves with the outer realities. Which brings us back to why I treasure so highly having my stories changed, having my narratives nudged in such a way that the world begins to make more sense. And that brings us to today's guest. Over the past few years, since I began reading his works, I'd have to say that he is by far the person who has most changed, most nudged my views, expanded my thinking, and dropped ideas into my skull that have really deeply rooted themselves. Ben Hunt is today's guest. He is co-founder and partner at Second Foundation Partners and an author at EpsilonTheory.com. Along with Rusty Gwynn and some other guest authors, Ben writes mainly on the economy and investment ideas, and it's there where you can read his work for free. But for those who want to participate and read it all, for those who want to join their pack, they also offer a premium subscription, which I can highly recommend. Ben is formerly the Chief Risk Officer and Chief Investment Strategist at Salient Partners. He holds a PhD in Philosophy and Political Science and Government from Harvard University. Ben, I'm very excited to have you finally on the program.
Wow, it's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for that introduction. And as a 55-year-old, I sure do share your appreciation for things that change your mind, right? It's really the only thing that matters.
It really is, and it's something that I treasure a lot at this point, and it's something that I feel also somewhat takes me out of step with the current culture in some respects.
Yeah, that's so right. That's so right. But this notion about changing your mind, I have one of the things that I've really found to be a good linchpin for thinking about, not just the stuff that I write about, but I was just, thinking about your introduction on this podcast to the things that you think about. There's this very fundamental notion about what makes the world, and in this I mean the physical world as well as the social world, go round, and it's a theoretical discipline called information theory that was really developed in the after World War II in the late 40s, in the early 1950s, and it's really something I think that underpins not just reality, but certainly our social realities. And the core notion of information theory, and I know you're going to appreciate this from your introduction here. The core notion of information theory is that, well, what is information? Information is measured by how much the thing changes our mind, right? Which is a pretty crazy way to look at it. So the information is measured not by, oh, this is true or this is false, right? That's not what information theory means when we say something is informative or lacks information. All it means is, does it change your mind? Is it some new signal about the world that's powerful enough to change your perception about the world? And once you start looking at the world through that lens of information theory, which it really is a fascinating subject. People want to go check it out because it really is an underpinning for everything. But this notion that the way we should think about the world and information is not just yes or no, true or false, but how much does it change our mind? What's the strength of information to change the way we perceive the world?
Well, that is absolutely fascinating, and almost as if there's a weighting we can give to it. And what I'm really enthralled with right now is the idea of what's the information we need? So listen, I have this theory. Mm-hmm. And the theory is we're at this rather momentous time in a species. Species go through, I'm a biologist by training. That's what my PhD is in, the biological side. So I look at kind of things, organisms and energy flows and that stuff, right? So I look at where we are as a species and I say, okay, we've kind of come through our adolescence, and like an adolescent, we're in a room, our own bedroom, and it's kind of dirty at this point. And we have to grow into adulthood, right? It's time to face up to the idea that, oh, I've got bills to pay and income and expenses have to sort of marry each other and all of that. And we're still acting across this globe writ large ecologically as if we haven't quite made that transition. So we're kind of like that 23-year-old still in his room. It's an awkward period. And so I'm wondering, what is the information that we would need to say limits exist and there are boundaries to things and we need to learn how to live within those? And how would we go about nudging that?
Yeah, Chris, I my field in academia and then teaching was mostly history. We call it political science, which is this bastard child of economics and history. And when I was in graduate school, I was much more on the science side of political science, and I was focused on econometric formulas and patterns of inference and the like. The older I get, the more I am focused on the history side of political science. And what I mean by that is looking at the way in which the past, it really does rhyme with the future. And what I mean by that in terms of your question is that I do think that there are periods of time in history where societies have wrestled with exactly this issue, right? With limits to growth, with, I'll call it political and social promises that can't be met by the resources of a society, right? That the government basically writes checks that the people can't can't cash, right? And it hasn't happened on I think certainly as global a scale as we have today, by no means, right? And certainly hasn't involved this many people, given the population of the world today versus at times in history. But I do think that there are some instructive historical periods that can speak to exactly that question you're asking.
And well, if we could look at some of those then, because you do write quite a bit about Yeats and his widening gyre. And it's, that was during World War I. Now we kind of seem to maybe be there again. The parallels to the political zeitgeist of World War I and now seem unavoidable, if not concerning, at least to me. Is this maybe what you're talking about?
It's exactly what I'm talking about. And what I find so I'll use the word revelatory, right? Is when you read the actual words of people who lived and wrote during these times of great upheaval, during these times where the chickens really did come home to roost. Right? We're not quite there yet, but I think a lot of people, like you, Chris, are getting an inkling. Right there, your spidey sense is starting to tingle for any comic book fans out there about where the world is right now, and frankly, I think the truth. Here I'm talking about truth when I just said that, it's just what it does that changes your mind. What changes a society's mind? What is the information that society has to see? Basically, I think that an entire society has to burn themselves on a really hot stove, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this happens every 3 or 4 generations. But I think we are at that point where this generation, the millennials coming of age, who are having to wrestle with what we boomers have done to the world, right? They're going to end up burning themselves on this hot stove, the hot stove of looking to government as the answer for everything that ails you, to looking towards your political leaders as somehow able to provide, use the term exponential growth, but I'll even narrow that a bit farther, a never-ending and exponential growth in a comfort and standard of living, right? And ultimately, you burn yourself on the hot stove of, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and if you're not going to pay for it in one way or another, right? And that can be in terms of resource extraction, in terms of taxation. It can be in the form of sacrifice of individual liberties, right? It really can. There's a price to be paid, though. That's the hot stove that I'm talking about. That hot stove can manifest itself in war. That certainly happened in the past. Yep. It can manifest itself, like say, in the subordination or the giving up of individual liberties. That certainly happened in the past. There are any number of ways in which that burning on the hot stove can happen. But that's what I think is the information that has to be processed. And unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy way or a gentle way to get that message across.
I just recently interviewed Benjamin Applebaum of the New York Times, and he wrote a book called The Economist's Hour. It's coming out soon. And what he showed was that, there's this whole Friedman and Volcker and all these characters, when they were making their decisions, the way he recast it historically, beautifully done with it, just this brings you into the room with them. They were just humans doing the best they could with imperfect information, survivor bias. We look back and go, oh, they did well. But what he's really talking about is the rise of the economist. And for somebody who studied economics quite a bit, I read this book called The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker. And right in the intro, he's got this piece about how the Santa Fe Institute, 1984, brings all these Nobel laureates in. They bring in the chemists, the physicists, the economists. They all start, powwowing and throwing their best ideas out on the table. And the physicists are just aghast that the economists are still using Walras's equations from the 1700s, before the second law of thermodynamics was discovered, and they were treating the economy, a complex system, as if it was a closed form. And he carries that through to current, and economists still have these closed form equations for what is arguably an open system, which means they've got the wrong models, which means they're seeking equilibrium where none exists, which says that they are essentially attempting to control the uncontrollable. And then he connects it to this other dot, which is amazing, which is that all complex systems owe their order and complexity to the flow of energy through them. Whether that system is my body, it's the earth with the sun, it's an economy. So when you put those dots together, it really feels to me like they're running the wrong models at the highest levels. They've really captured the imagination during a wonderfully abundant period of time, but maybe the models aren't quite right now. I thought you captured that beautifully in something called the three-body problem, which was one of those articles that really just snapped things into focus for me. Can we talk about the three-body problem?
Absolutely. And before we do, though, I just want to make 2 notes, right? The first is that at its core, information theory, which I started talking about at the outset here, at its core, that is a theory of entropy. So that when you kind of look at modern thermodynamics and entropy theory. It's all based on this theory of information theory. The second, you're so right about that these people, these human beings, they're doing the best they can. We've lionized them and turned them into, deities. Mm-hmm. But again, this is why I like reading biography. I like reading history. One book I can really recommend to you and to your audience is this book, Lords of Finance, by Liaquat Ahmed. So it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's about the central bankers. It's about the subtitle is The Bankers Who Broke the World, and it looks at monetary history, the birth of central banking at the tail end of World War I, and then leading up to World War II. And you read the stories of these people, right, who put on their pants, one leg at a time, just like you and me. But even then, we're lionized and turned into these, almost, deity-like figures, mm-hmm. which we do all the time, of course, in politics as well as in economics. But it really is in reading books like that can change your perception, not just of the past, but also of the current. So it's, two things I'd, highly recommend. Anything you can find on information theory, and then this book, Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World. One wonderful book to get that perspective that you were describing there. So the three-body problem, right? So the three-body problem is referring to a mathematical problem, right? So the three-body problem is the idea that, let's say you're in outer space, all right, and you've got three planets that are out there, and let's say that you also know everything about those three objects, right? Let's say you know their mass, you know their velocity, you know the laws of gravity and how they interact with each other. And let's go a little farther. Let's say that you are almost omniscient here, and that you really have an ability to measure these three planets that are in outer space, and there's nothing else out there. And so the question is the core question of the three-body problem is, all right, tell me, Mr. Scientist, what is the algorithm? What is the formula for predicting, for telling me where those three planets are going to be at some point in the future? Right now, it would seem like, okay, there's got to be a formula that can predict their future position, right? Because we know everything about them. We know the laws of gravity. We know exactly their mass, their speed, their position. We can calculate where they are going to be 1 second from now. So there must be some sort of formula. Some sort of a formula that can tell us where they're going to be at any time in the future, right? That we just kind of plug in all these variables, and there's got to be a formula that can solve the three-body problem. And the truth is, and this was proven in the late 1800s, and it's something that's really hard to wrap your head around. Actually, there is no formula. There is, technically speaking, no closed-end solution, meaning that there is no algorithm for determining where those three planets are going to be at some point in the future. We really can calculate it, meaning that, okay, I see where they are now. I know all the information about them, so I can calculate their positions like 1 second from now, and then I can do another calculation to say, well, it'll be 1 second after that. But there's no just formula, no closed-in solution, no algorithm where I can plug in the data and just say, okay, calculate where that's going to be for me, 1,000 seconds from now. It is not a predictable system. And this is true for just with three objects, right?
Just
and so
three.
Imagine a world, right, where our economic world, where we have a hell of a lot more than three big objects that are exerting their gravity on our economic world. Imagine what happens when you get a new object, central banks that start to exert the gravity of purchasing $20 trillion worth of securities.
Right. It's like a black hole wandered into our solar system.
Exactly. And it's not that it's hard to predict what's going to happen. The truth of a three-body problem is that it is impossible to predict what's going to happen. That closed-in solution, it does not exist. And it requires, I think, of us, and again, this is really hard for us to grapple with as human beings, it requires of us to have what I like to call a profound agnosticism, right? That we have to be able to distance ourselves from the stories we've been told about how to predict the future, whether that's our economic future or our political future. It really requires us to like I say, to step back, to create some distance, and evaluate for ourselves, right, where do we think the world should go from here? Because it's not predictable based on what we've been told from the past.
Well, and what's fascinating, and beautifully said, by the way, I love this idea because it simplifies it down to just three bodies, right? If you can't calculate three bodies, forget about your closed form equations trying to calculate what lowering interest rates is going to do to unemployment or, corporate investment. It's unpredictable. We can observe it. And this has been the maddening part to me, is that the central banks went on this rescue spree starting in 2008. It was an emergency. Okay, I'll grant you that. But 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. But here we are 11 years into the emergency with more of the same. And arguably, the outcomes they were seeking are not materializing for some reason. So you'd think there would be some empirical sort of testing to say
humility.
Yeah, maybe just a little something like, I don't know, but I also left an academic environment, and I thought I wanted to be a professor. In fact, I love teaching, but I discovered, because I'm a quick learner eventually, I discovered that colleges and universities don't really care about teaching. So I exited that. But what I learned was, and really took to heart, was the ego and the inability of the person truly invested in their dogma to shift that belief is startling, powerful. And that's been sort of my critique, is that the central banks have somehow become populated with dogmatists. And it's been startling to watch how this idea of a three-body problem, that humility, has not yet seemed to seep into any of their public statements to any appreciable degree.
Well, and this is again what you see in history, right? These are the seeds that always seem to sprout, and ultimately, every third or fourth generation, like I say, has got to learn this lesson the hard way. Mm-hmm. It in a lot of respects it is similar to the 1930s, right, where you similarly had emergency government policy or emergency government action, let's say, mm-hmm. become permanent government policy, and that's what I really think happened in early 2009 with emergency central bank action. First, our Federal Reserve, and then other central banks. Again, as you say, emergency action that I really approve of. Right? It's like if you remember the movie Pulp Fiction, right? Mm-hmm. The Uma Thurman character, her heart stopped, and the John Travolta character gets a syringe of adrenaline and plunges it right into Uma Thurman's heart to get it beating again. I really think that's what the Federal Reserve did in March of 2009. And I think that's what central banks are supposed to do. They were created to be that last gasp measure, that provider of liquidity into a global capital market system where the heart has stopped beating. They were that syringe of adrenaline. But again, the problem is, and we saw this in the 1930s as well, we see it in so many examples, large and small in history, is that emergency government action becomes permanent government policy. And I'm not even saying that that's good or that's bad, right? I'm just saying it is. It is. And that's what we're wrestling with today, where that single shot of adrenaline has been replaced by a constant intravenous drip of adrenaline, of stimulus, of constant stimulus, right? As if we were in a world, an economic world at least, where we can't survive without the stimulus, without that constant drip of policy support. You see it everywhere in the world today. You particularly see it in Europe, right? But you also see it over here, and it's that transformation, right, into a world where we are told that this is costless, that the constant stimulus can be achieved without cost, right? That's what creates, I think, ultimately that condition where we burn ourselves on a really hot stove. That's how these seeds are planted.
Yes, and psychology teaches us people either change through insight or pain. And I see your work is attempting to bring insight out there and say, hey, we could do this way too, right? We could look at this stuff and change that way, or we could touch the hot stove. Both are ways humans do this. And of all your many thought-provoking pieces, This Is Water was one I had to read a couple times because it speaks to this idea of financialization. And a quote from that, which is, I'm going to read your words here, quote, says, "Financialization is squeezing more earnings from $1 of sales without squeezing at all, but through tax arbitrage or financial balance sheet arbitrage. Financialization is profit growth without labor productivity growth." And end quote. I love that because really, you say, the central banks are really, I think what you talked about was how they were designed in 1913, which was during an emergency, high quality collateral, take it at a discount, but get the money back out there, to the point now where my sense is, from Greenspan through Bernanke, through Yellen, through Powell, they are now sort of the owners. You break it, you buy it. They're the owners of a highly financialized system that is, to me, I got a short seller mentality. I'm a little skeptical of things. I'm very skeptical that this idea that you can constantly make money with money and that all ends well is a good story to run by. But it seems to be the one that we're really addicted to at this point in time. Do you agree with that? And where does that seems to have a conclusion that it's headed towards?
Well, you use the right word there. You use the word addiction. And see, that's what happens. It is that difference between, using an addictive substance to save your life, right? Mm-hmm. And then using it to support, well, it feels good, right? So the zero interest rate policy, making money so readily available and so cheap, right? I really do think it saved the world in March of 2009. I get it. I think that's what, what the central bank was created to do, to be that lender of last resort. But when then it takes the position, not the lender of last resort, but the lender of first resort, the lender of constant resort, that's where we are now, right? And what happens, and this is the point of the note, This Is Water, and what I think is happening with financialization, is that if I'm running a corporation, I'm trying to do well by myself, by my shareholders, why in the world would I take a risky action, like actually building a new factory, like actually investing for growth, and this is what I mean about investing for productive activities in the future. Why would I take that sort of risk? And it is a risk, right? When I can borrow the money essentially risk-free and use it to do something that is risk-free, like buy back my stock, like give a dividend, right, to my shareholders, all of which things drive up the value of the asset, the financial asset, all of these things which drive up the earnings per share, but none of these things are adding to the productivity of what I'm doing, right? The what I call the labor productivity. I'm not investing in technology or property, plant, and equipment in order to get more out of to squeeze more juice out of my sales dollar. I'm just not squeezing at all. I'm able to use that addiction that our society has to free money, to cheap money, to generate wealth for myself and my shareholders in this non-productive way. And you say, is there a cost to that? Of course there is, right? We're told that the stimulus is costless, but what it costs us in truth is that we're not taking risks anymore for the future. We're not investing in the future anymore. And where do we end up with that? We end up with essentially, zombie societies and zombie economies, which just makes the ultimate burning on the hot stove that much worse.
Indeed, and you made this point in the long now. You talked about personal courage, where we need leaders who act as stewards of the future, not managers of the now. And I watched over my lifetime that the central banks, and by the way, my grandfather served on the New York Fed board under Volcker at a time. So I come from a long line of bankers. So, but mm-hmm. he passed away a while ago, but he would be absolutely unable to grok what's going on today, where the central banks went from intervening rarely and under very carefully to the point where now, if the S&P is off 2%, I can guarantee you we're going to get a Fed official out making soothing statements in an hour, right? So they're managing like moment by moment now, and that's hard to believe in for me. But maybe I'm just out of step.
Our politicians as well. I mean, look at. This is true whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, right? Whether you're talking about the White House or the Senate or whatever, our political leaders are similarly not acting as stewards for the future, but are acting as managers for right now. They want the results right now, right now. Let's pull the future forward to today, because that's what I'm being judged on. With politicians, I guess I understand it a little bit better because they are being judged on, what's the next vote count, right? But as you say, it's really perplexing to me when I look at these institutions like a central bank that were designed to be not managers of the here and now, but truly to be stewards of a future. And we really did used to think that way, or institutionally the thought process was there, and that became subverted over the last really 25 years in exactly the way you described, this hubris of academic overconfidence that we have the models, the theories, that we're so smart that we don't have to act as stewards, or rather we can act as stewards and as managers of the now. And again, this is what history teaches us, that's never possible. It's never possible. You talk about limits to growth. I think that there is a possibility of long sustained growth, but not at exponential levels, because exponential growth in the now requires debt, right? It requires pulling forward of future production, future productivity, future growth. And we've pulled it all forward into the now. And that ultimately, again, I think is what leads to the, burning on a hot stove.
Well, absolutely. And, one of the charts, if somebody says, okay, Chris, I'll give you one. economically, I'll say, wow, well, look at total credit market debt in the United States, compounding since 1970 at 8.9%, and nominal and real growth are both compounding at less than half that rate. So if the debt is a claim on something, what's it a claim on? Well, you can't grow your claims on the real economy at twice the rate forever. It's a compounding problem. So that raises a million questions, and in the time we have left, I need to turn now to this idea of, so let's imagine we have all these sort of forces building, and my spidey senses are tingling right now, right? A lot of people are. We've got the yellow vests in France, we've got Hong Kong erupting, we've got that sort of thing that you get at these turning moments. And I want to talk now about this idea of how things go from private knowledge into common knowledge, and maybe the role of the missionary and all that. Because to me, that's the central, most important point of the day, is how things suddenly erupt into common knowledge.
Well, what you're getting at really is in a sense how we, I'll put it this way, what can we do about this? Mm-hmm. Right? What can we do about it? Right. Now one path, right, is that, you and I and your listeners, we see what's going on and we say, okay, my answer is I'm going to withdraw. Basically, I'm going to try to create as best I can some sort of walled garden to protect, myself, my family, my pack, as I like to call it. Yep. Right, and we're going to, protect ourselves, and that's absolutely what everyone should be doing. And I think that there are ways that we can try to participate in what's going on to, if not reverse the course, if not, prevent burning on a hot stove, right? At least make the burn, right? Non-fatal, right? At least try to, change or shorten the period of pain that has to come here, to shorten it from 100 years to 10 years. Right. Right. We named our firm Second Foundation Partners after the Isaac Asimov trilogy, the Foundation trilogy, where, the goal there of the people who set up the Second Foundation, it wasn't to prevent the galaxy from falling into a dark age. It was trying to prevent it from lasting 10,000 years, right? Yep. So I do think there's something we can do, right? And what it requires is what you're asking about, this notion of how do we create common knowledge. Right. So let me back up a second. What is common knowledge? Because common knowledge isn't necessarily public knowledge. Common knowledge is a term of art in game theory, and what it describes is an idea, information that we think everyone else thinks. Right? That's what common knowledge is. It's not what we think personally about something, right? That's we call that our first level, knowledge. It's not even what we think is the consensus. It's not even what we think that everyone thinks, right? It's what everyone thinks that everyone thinks. Is this third level of trying to understand information and how it flows through a society. It's the crowd looking at the crowd. Let me give you some examples of common knowledge. When you watch a sitcom on TV, it has a laugh track, right? That laugh tracks exist because it creates common knowledge that scene was funny. Right? They do all sorts of studies on this stuff. You and I, when we're watching we're watching Friends, right? Yeah, we really will think that scene is funnier when we hear a fake crowd laughing. We know it's a fake crowd. It doesn't matter. We're hardwired to respond to this stuff, right? We are biologically evolved to respond to this stuff, right? We, the human social animal, responds to, our crowd of humans responds to what we think the crowd believes. And once you kind of start thinking about media and information this way, that it's the crowd watching the crowd, it really changes how you think about the world. So I'll give you another example. So the next time you listen to a speech, a political speech that Donald Trump gives, just watch for this. The first thing he will say in that political speech is he will talk about the size of the crowd. He will call the crowd's attention to the crowd itself. That's totally intentional. About midway through his speech, he'll pause and he'll start to say again, wow, look at the size of this crowd. There haven't been so many people here ever. Mm-hmm. Right? Look at all you folks. This is amazing, the size of this crowd. Again, intentionally getting the crowd to look at itself. The last thing he'll say in the speech, you've been an amazing crowd. This has been the most amazing crowd ever in this auditorium or arena or whatever. It's been the biggest crowd. We had lines going back forever. 3 times in the speech, the beginning and the middle and the end, he will call the attention of the crowd to the crowd itself. This is entirely intentional, right? It's what successful politicians and central bankers and advertisers and everyone else have always known, that the way to create common knowledge, what the crowd believes that the crowd believes, is to get them to look at themselves. Now, where does this go? What this goes is that each of us, you, Chris, me, Ben, I think we can make a difference by showing people that we are not alone in having these thoughts, that there is a crowd of us who are uncomfortable with the way that the world is going, who think that there is a better way for organizing ourselves economically and politically, right? That by showing a crowd of people that this crowd of us exists, it really can take on a life of its own. That's how we change things, Chris. It's through podcasts like yours, it's through writing like mine, and it's allowing the crowd to see that there is a crowd of people who share these beliefs. That's what we can do. That's the participation that works in these situations. It's not from some top-down, joining a political party or something like that. No, it always comes from the bottom up. It always comes from a movement of a crowd watching the crowd. And that's what we can do to change things, Chris.
Fantastic. And that spawns 1,000 questions and observations for me, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. So thank you so much for your time today, Ben. Please, before you have to run, tell people, again, how to follow you and subscribe and become an active participant, please.
Well, thanks, Chris. So the name of the website is epsilontheory.com. And this comes after in economics and investing, we talk about alpha, we talk about beta, and there's also this forgotten term called epsilon for error. And it's not error, right? What you find in the epsilon term in these investment models and the like, that's where human interaction exists, right? That's where common knowledge exists. That's where game theory exists, and that's where we can make a difference. So I've named the blog Epsilon Theory. We've got about 100,000 email subscribers. It's free. By all means, check it out. Sign up to get our occasional emails, read our stuff, and when you're ready, come join our pack, because I really think we are making a difference, just like you are, Chris.
Well, fantastic. And it does begin with this idea that we need, I think it's the most important thing, is to help elevate things to common knowledge. One of my I run a tweet that I put out pretty constantly, which is a meme. It's a picture, a guy sitting behind a desk with a coffee cup that says, U.S. equity markets are a government-operated utility. Changed my mind. And I'm just trying to get people to engage with that idea, because I think a lot of people are holding this private knowledge that things aren't quite right, but they don't feel safe yet to talk about it. And that's what's about to emerge is, we'll go through Schopenhauer's 3 stages, right? Ridiculed, fought, self-evident. That's where this truth is going to eventually get. So you're early on that truth piece. Thank you so much for doing what you do. Thank you for your time today. And really, from me personally, thank you for writing the pieces that you do, because they've changed my mind and how I think about things.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me. Love to come down again.
Thank you. Will do.